I've had this story on my mind for a long, long time. I've always been a fan of the supernatural and cryptid scene, but never had any standout experiences myself. I lived in the northern Midwest my whole life, and have come to appreciate the local lore that comes with it. This is a story about my first real cryptid experience. It's a long one, but I hope you enjoy. In my late teens, I worked at a camp for a few summers. The camp was massive, with only about 1/5 of it being equipped for hospitality, dining hall, cabins, shower houses, etc., and the rest being the wilderness. The land had 6 lakes on it, all connected by small rivers. What made this camp particularly eerie, however, was the fact that it was actually built around native burial grounds. I won't get into the legends around the burial mounds, but overall, this place checked all the boxes of a B-list horror movie. Now, my job at the camp was sort of a catch-all. I was a program director, lifeguard, cook, gift shop manager, and basically if they needed a role filled, I was the one doing it. It kept me busy, and I had many long days. I would close the gift shop at around 7 each night, and then head upstairs to the kitchen. I could walk back to my cabin if I wanted, but the cook hated the dark, absolutely hated it. So I'd help him with the dishes and cutting fruit for breakfast the next morning, and then walk him to his cabin. I have one rule though, no flashlights. You can't see very well in the woods if your eyes are focused on a small beam of light. So every night in the moonlight, I would walk him to his cabin and then walk the public road to mine. My ulterior motive for taking the public road was, well, I'm a smoker and we have to be a good role model for the kids. No smoking at camp, but they can't tell me what to do on public property. My cabin was right on the edge of the hospitable portion of the land. Miles of marshlands and forests sat behind my cabin, and fortunately or unfortunately, I had the cabin all to myself. But the weird thing was that every night I would be smoking and walking the public road, I would hear screaming in the woods. It sounded like a woman being murdered. I brushed it off the first night. There's a public access lake, people get rowdy, and sound carries. It could be a prank, or a fox, or an owl. It's the woods, but it kept happening every night, as soon as I stepped onto the road. I decided to not let it bother me, and I had to be up early every day. No sense in chasing noises around in the dark. I would get to my cabin, spread some tobacco for the land, and sleep soundly every night. Well, the end of summer came around. It was always bittersweet. You eat 3 meals a day with the same people for 3 months. They start to grow on you. One goodbye tradition we kept up over the years was on the final new moon of the camp season, the rangers would take the staff for a spirit walk. He'd share the legends of the land with the new staff and try to shake them up a bit. We would hike through the back of the camp, around the marshes and lakes, and see what kind of spooky things we could stir up. We all met at the only streetlight on the public road that night, but that year the ranger had his rifle slung over his shoulder. We ran into a cougar the year before, and the 2 wolves lived in the back of the property, so I didn't think much of it. The rules were simple: no flashlights, no jingling keys, no running. If you run, we might not find you. They were half to scare people and half true. The woods were thick and the marshes were dangerous. Everything was going smoothly till we reached the river crossing not too far from the public road. It takes you to a clearing just before the trail reconnects to the road behind my cabin. The moment we crossed the bridge, the woods went dead silent. You could hear yourself breathing. That, my friends, is one of the scariest things that can happen to you in the woods: silence. And then, just like every night before, a blood-curdling scream ripped across the clearing. One of the new staff was about to take off before myself and another grabbed his arms. "That's the screaming I've been hearing," I told my boss. "That's the scream I hear every night." The ranger shushed everyone. The scream came again, louder this time. The ranger whistled in the direction of the noise, and it whistled back. Suddenly, the screaming surrounded us. Behind us, to the right, to the left, the group closed in, shoulder to shoulder, not daring to even breathe. The ranger, ever serious and calm, said barely over a whisper, "We're turning around. Take the bridge back to the trail. We're going the long way." So, in hurried steps, we made our way back to the streetlights that we met under without muttering a word. Once we were in the light again, I could tell that the ranger was actually shaken up. This is the same man that was charged by a cougar in the dark and brushed it off. "I need a cigarette." "You haven't smoked in like 2 years." "I need a cigarette." I wasn't about to argue with the man holding a rifle, so I obliged. After a few drags, he muttered, "I don't want to scare anyone, but I know only one creature that can mimic human voices like that." "It's a Wendigo," I said, not even thinking. I was in shock. All summer I walked that road, and this thing was out there, screaming, trying to lure me in. That's when he said yes. He thought the same thing. He first thought it was one of the neighboring property owners looking for their dog, calling out for them, so he whistled. And then he explained the gun. All spring, he was finding deer strewn around the property. Not unusual, being that it's the woods and all, but there was so many, and they were brutally taken down. He said that these things looked like they had been hit by cars in the middle of the woods. They were absolutely mangled, and more bizarrely, no other animals would touch them. No tracks that said a bear or a wolf or a cougar was there. He was worried with something that was bringing big game down like that, so he brought his rifle. No one said much after that. My boss got sage from her cabin and gave it to everyone who asked for a blessing. We were shaken up. After that, I changed cabins. I didn't own much in general at the time, so I wasn't troubled in the least to get off the public road. I didn't even care that I had to row out into the middle of the lake to have a cigarette. I wasn't stepping foot on that road. And I'm a little sorry to say that I never stepped foot back on that property. Call me superstitious, but I couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods, not even if you paid me. I was about 16 at the time. I'm half indigenous, and I was visiting my uncle on my mom's side, the indigenous side, at his cabin located in the woods of northwestern Maine, because I was driving my grandpa up to visit them for the fall season. The cabin was rather small and could only accommodate my uncle, aunt, and grandpa, so I was told to sleep in the camper that was set back further into the woods. That evening went as usual. My aunt made dinner, and we all laughed and shared stories, and eventually turned in for the night. I took a flashlight and started my way out to the camper. About halfway down, I shut off the flashlight and looked up to admire the night sky. It was at this point I noticed how quiet the forest had become. There were no birds or sounds or crickets or rustling leaves. It was just pure silence. I suddenly got this intense feeling of dread deep within my gut, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The voice in my head told me to bolt to the camper as fast as I could. For some reason, my instincts told me I didn't belong there and something was watching me. When I made it to the camper, I slammed the door shut and double locked it, closing the window blinds. I swear I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I laughed at myself for getting so worked up over nothing. The entire night, I was restless in my sleep. I couldn't help but hear footsteps and movement all around the camper. I told myself it was just curious animals and grazing deer, but my dreams were haunted by something I couldn't see. Unfortunately, this would not be my final experience of the weekend. By morning, all seemed normal. I thought about mentioning what had happened to my grandfather over breakfast, but I was worried that he would brush me off as being overdramatic or being too used to the city life. I let the odd night slide off my mind as I enjoyed the day with my family and their big shepherd Frank. Just to calm my nerves, I asked for Frank to accompany me to the camper that evening to ensure I felt safe. The walk back was once again fine until I began to enter the tree line. I'm not sure if it was because I was feeling nervous as well, but Frank seemed to be on edge with his ears perked and his head on a swivel. That night, he slept in the bed of the trailer with me. I felt safer with a dog there, However, I had an extremely awful dream in which when I awoke, Frank was staring at the wall of the trailer with his ears standing on end. When the morning hit, I packed my bags to leave in the afternoon and brought Frank out of the trailer and led him out to the small field between the cabin and the thick woods. I was kicking his ball for him to excitedly chase, grab, and return to me. We continued this game until I kicked the ball a bit too hard and it rolled down to the edge of the woods. Frank raced down to grab the ball until his full sprint turned into a full stop, digging his paws into the dirt, meters past where the ball had landed. He was standing stiff, fur on end, ears pinned back, and unmoving. I called for him to come, which he always responded to, but he didn't even acknowledge me. I began to walk down to where he was, calling his name a little bit louder with no response. I grabbed him by the collar, getting kind of worried at this point as his eyes stared directly into the trees. I yelled his name loudly, giving him a little tug. The forest was silent. Moments later, the silence was broken by an echo of my voice, yelling back. However, this echo was delayed and distorted. It sounded like me, but also not like me. I froze and looked into the dark woods, holding my breath, only for another scream to come from the woods and my voice. I immediately turned and booked it back to the cabin. I came to my aunt crying and telling her that there was something out in those woods. She comforted me and told me it must have been nothing, but she seemed as if that was not the answer she wanted to give. My family is rather superstitious, especially me. I'm guessing she didn't want me to overthink anything. I left that afternoon and have not been back since. Let me start by saying that I have lived in the Appalachian Mountains all my life, and I've experienced a lot of strange things. My family was Irish and settled in West Virginia, but I currently live in the North Carolina portion of these wonderful mountains. That being said, I learned a lot of what really lurks in these dark woods, but this was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It all began with my golden retriever Ozzy growling like I had never heard before. He literally never growls, so that made me already uncomfortable, but this growl was bone-chilling. It was like he was getting ready to have a fight for his life or something. I took both him and my other dog out around 11 p.m., and he would not leave my side. I noticed that my workshop door was open, so I walked down to close it and lock it up. The entire time he was glued to my side. Ozzy also kept trying to get in between my legs, still growling, and all his hair was sticking straight up like a feral animal. The second I closed the door, all hell breaks loose in the woods. It sounded like 50 full-grown men had broken out into a full sprint, tearing through the woods. Trees were shaking and branches were falling. In my life, I have never been that scared. We got back into the house before I shit my pants and grabbed my pistol and light to figure out what the hell was out there. When the dog and I got back outside, we were surrounded by what sounded like people mumbling. It was everywhere. I shined the light all over the woods and couldn't see anything, but the sound was coming from all around. It sounded as if you got a full gym of people to baby mumble. You could almost make out the words. That's why I don't think it was an animal. I almost immediately felt sick, like I was having a mix between a panic attack and the flu. Back inside the house, it sounded like people were walking around all night. The windows were creaking and you could clearly hear the sound of shoes on gravel. The mumbling never stopped. Every time I got up to check the house, my feet would touch the floor and it would go dead silent. You couldn't hear birds, crickets, frogs, or anything. I was terrified and didn't sleep a wink. The air felt thick and evil all night. That's the only way I could explain the feeling. Imagine a soaking wet quilt being tossed over you. That's how I felt. I'm looking for any answers as to what this could be. This wasn't like the normal spooky stories my grandma and great uncles used to tell me.